Good day, everyone. I am your reporter for today, Kimberly Zane Dulay, and I will be discussing the characteristics of Hebrew literature. In its essence, Hebrew literature is historical, national, deed-based narrative prose. In other words, it is narrative prose that is based on an understanding of time as the flow of history, of man as a part of a nation, and of reality as a series of action rather than a constellation of objects in space. The contents of my report are Hebrew literature, biblical period narrative, biblical period poetry, biblical period law, biblical period prophecy and wisdom, rabbinic period Mishnah, rabbinic period Talmud, Middle Ages and Renaissance, modern period. Hebrew literature is literature written by Jews in Hebrew and by extension, certain theological and scholarly works translated from the Hebrew by Jewish scholars. Hebrew was the principal literary language of the Jews until the 19th century, when European languages came into use for works of modern Jewish scholarship, and Yiddish became a vehicle of literary expression. Yiddish language, one of the many Germanic languages that form a branch of the Indo-European language family. Since the establishment of Hebrew as the official language of Israel in 1948, a large body of fiction and non-fiction has been written in the language. Biblical period. Ancient Hebrew literature consists mainly of the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. It forms the bedrock of much subsequent Hebrew literature as a source of authority, themes, and language. Hebrew Bible, also called Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, or Tanakh, collection of writings that was first compiled and preserved as the sacred book of the Jewish people. It also constitutes a large portion of the Christian Bible. Viewed in literary terms, the core of the Hebrew Bible is an epic saga that extends from the book of Genesis to the book of Kings, and describes the formation of the Jewish people and their relation with God. This story is told through different kinds of literary materials, mainly narrative, poetry, and law. Biblical period narrative. A consciousness of time pervades the Bible. Rather than presenting a set of unchanging truths, the Hebrew Bible tells the story of a relationship that unfolds in history. This relationship is embodied in the concept of the covenant, a compact in which God promises to protect Israel and Israel promises to keep the divine law. Covenant is an agreement, usually formal, between two or more persons to do or not to do something specified. After relating the events leading up to the institution of the covenant, in the book of Genesis and Exodus, the narrative describes a widening cycle of disobedience, warning from Hebrew prophets, and punishment. This cycle leads to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the Babylonian captivity, and the return to Israel. Biblical period poetry. Some books of the Bible are written entirely in poetry, including Psalms, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Psalm. The book was originally titled Tehillim, which means praise songs in Hebrew. The English title of Psalms originated the Septuagint's Greek title, Psalmoi, also means Song of Praise. Song of Songs is truly one of the most beautiful love poems ever written. The song describes the courtships and marriage customs of the time. and can be read as an inspired portrayal of ideal human love. Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word indicating a person who calls an assembly, so it makes sense that the author identified himself in Ecclesiastes 1:1 by the Hebrew word kohelet, translated as preacher, despite giving only this rather mysterious name to indicate his identity. Evidence in the book, along with most Jewish and Christian traditions, suggests that King Solomon authored Ecclesiastes. In addition, whole poems and poetic fragments are scattered throughout the narrative sections as well. When poetry appears in conjunction with narrative, its function is to extract and heighten the religious message being conveyed. Within the poetry section, the telling of the Covenant Saga alternates with hymns, in which the listeners are invited to join in praising God's intervention in history. Biblical Period Law. The biblical period in the book of Exodus led to the revelation of the Torah to the Israelite people at Mount Sinai. Book of Exodus comes from the Septuagint, which derives it from the primary event found in the book, the deliverance from slavery and exodus, or departure of the Israelite nation out of Egypt by the hand of Yahweh, the God of their forefathers. Torah of Moses. As a revealed literature, word for word dictation to Moses is to be traced to a late Second Temple construction of the Pentateuch as Apocalypse. The move is the evident in the book of Jubilees, who introduces his works with a detailed account of revelation at Sinai that includes his own work, the division of the times, an apocalypse, but not the Torah of Moses. The revelation represents the formal offering and the acceptance of the covenant, whose terms are set out as a set of divinely ordained commandments. God's protection of Israel within the vicissitudes of history is made dependent upon faithfulness to these commandments. Biblical period prophecy and wisdom. The role of prophet is the true calling in the Hebrew Bible. The prophet is chosen by God to be the vehicle, often involuntary, for God's word. This burden is difficult and often anguish and dangerous. The prophet has the gift of moral vision, which comprehends the relationship between the present action of the nation and the terms of the covenant. In addition, the prophet alone understands the corruptions he sees will inevitably result in God's abandonment of Israel and its destruction. The challenge becomes how to communicate this unpopular message. The prophet performs symbolic acts to draw attention to it, but in the end must rely upon words of persuasion, employing such means as hyperbole, exaggeration, parable, literary illustration, ridicule, figures of speech, and dramatization. Rabbinic period. Change historical circumstances, including subjugation of the Jews by the Romans and others, created a need for further developments in Hebrew law and religious ideas in the first centuries of the first millennium AD. After the completion of the Hebrew Bible and the end of prophecy, God's will could be discovered only through the interpretation of the written record of what had already been revealed. A new class of religious leaders called rabbis, teachers, arose to teach the law and apply it to current conditions. The rabbinic period lasted for about the first 500 years of the Christian era. Rabbis derived their authority from mastery of the oral Torah. This they conceive of as a body of law and interpretations, which was revealed to Moses along with the written Torah, and subsequently passed down by word of mouth from teachers to disciples. The two main types of the oral Torah are Halakha and Haggadah. Halakha consists of statements about practical legal matters and obligations, whereas the Haggadah comprises legends and lore that surround the law. Rabbinic period Mishnah. The Mishnah, which was compiled in Palestine around AD 200, is a brief legal code that summarizes the decisions of the oral Torah under 6 headings: agricultural, festivals, civil law, women, ritual purity, and sacrifices. Like biblical law, the Mishnah does not simply record the law but also offers a map of an ideal sacred world. Rabbinic period Talmud. The discussion about the Mishnah were compiled and edited in the Talmud. The Palestinian Talmud was completed about AD 500 and the Babylonian Talmud about AD 600. Unlike the Mishnah, which is a code organized around topics, the Talmud, a document of vastly great length, is a commentary that seeks to reconstruct and understand the reasoning behind the Mishnah concise rulings. The Babylonian Talmud became the universally accepted authoritative text of the world Jewry, and the chief object of scholarly study until the modern period of Hebrew literature. Middle Ages and Renaissance. The 1,000 years following the Arab conquest of Palestine in the 7th century saw a great flowering of Hebrew literature. Although it continued to focus on law and interpretation, Hebrew literature branched into many new areas of creativity during this period. The earliest Hebrew prayer books were compiled about 800 AD, and the first dictionary of the Talmud was written about 900. Hebrew prayer book, Siddur. Hebrew order. Plural Siddurim or Siddurs, Jewish prayer book, which contains the entire Jewish liturgy used on the ordinary Sabbath and on weekdays for domestic as well as synagogue ritual. This is distinguished from the Mazor, which is prayer book used for the high holidays. First dictionary of the Talmud. The Hebrew term Talmud, study or learning, commonly refers to a compilation of ancient teachings regarded as sacred and normative by Jews from the time it was compiled until modern times, and is still so regarded by the traditional religious Jewish. Modern period. Haskalah. In the late 1700s, the effort of German Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn to acquaint the Jews of Central Europe with Western culture initiated the movement known as the Haskalah. Enlightenment. National Revival. Within the context of National Revival, Hebrew literature took an inward turn to examine the dilemma of the individual. Into the new homeland. The settlement of Jews in Palestine during the first half of the 20th century gave a new impetus and direction to Hebrew literature, although the first emigrant prose writers were still emotionally tied to the past. Israeli literature. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 thrust into a prominence a younger generation of writers who had grown in the new land and knew little of the East European Jewish life. And that's all for my report. Thank you for listening.